Hello everyone. My name is Tian, and I am now a PhD candidate studying translation studies in Queen's University, Belfast. And today, what I'd like to talk about is really how we understand translation and how that understanding of translation help us in understanding cultures. This talk really derives from a double initial proposition. Firstly, the practice of translation is central, not only to transmission across cultural boundaries, but also to how individual texts and writers are thought of and used within the contours of individual cultures. But too often, this cultural presence is ignored by the people that use it. And secondly, because translation involves the representation of acts of interpreting or interpretation, invariably translation is a process that hands over an object that is different from the original, sometimes subtly so, sometimes more obviously so, as in the West Side Story journey from Romeo and Juliet. In other words, translation studies is a sort of elephant in the room. For many people, translation studies is relegated to a sub-discipline of linguistics concerning the main with the mechanics of language transfer. But translation studies is more concerned both to interpret the cultural context in which language is used and to mediate the gaps of understanding they invariably open up between the context of one culture and another. Nearly all research in translation studies is done outside the field of linguistics. Translation studies itself is connecting with an ever wider range of disciplines, especially those whose central work is related more or less in translation or to translation, such as drama. So this is our conceptual and disciplinary background, and this paper will ask how an awareness of translation complexity would impact our understanding of culture. What are the wider implications of acknowledging what is now accepted as the cultural term in translation studies? Translation, of course, is central to the very definition of culture and to the myriad practices that together configure our idea of culture. This is why David Jones and Susan Bostnet have published a special issue of the Translator in 2019, dedicated to what they term the outward turn, in which they write, it is a mistake to conceive translation studies as somehow a linear in its development, no matter how neat a trajectory some of its historiographers may have claimed to be able to trace. If anything, what marks translation studies as an increasingly open discipline is that it both offers and traffics in key concepts rooted in the discourse of difference, simultaneity, contingency, mobility, and hospitality, concepts whose continuous interplay serves to deepen, no less than to extend, the scope of its inquiry and the value of its insights. If translation studies functions in any meaningful way, it is as the enriched palimpsest of the ideas and methods of writers and philosophers, of theorists and practitioners from a range of disciplines across time and space. End of quote. So let's trace this development of cultural turn to outward turn. And following that, the paper will identify translation in two key aspects of the definition of culture, namely culture as a system and culture as science meanings. So the central notion of translational equivalence functions in many ways, from the false promises of linguistic equivalence to the working practices of the conceptual equivalence that lie at the heart of different translation purposes. Moving beyond the apparent linguistic base of translation studies, scholars propose a cultural turn in which they note that in the discipline of translation studies, what is studied is the text embedded in its network of both source and target cultural signs. This is why Bosnet called for a translation turn in cultural studies, where she emphasizes the importance of deepening the cooperation between the two disciplines to enable a deeper understanding of cultural practice and flow, and indeed, through that, research practices more alive to the omnipresence of translation. And in the outward turn, Boston and Johnson note that translation mediation is still largely invisible, writing that academic disciplines such as literary studies, globalization studies, media and cultural studies still tend to ignore translation. This paper then following the call for the outward turn and focusing on culture, tries to identify some of the reasons behind this already very influential proposal to reinforce translation studies. Again, in the words of Boston and Johnson, both as a hub discipline within the academy and as a conjoined theoretical wing of a practice that spans the key human process of becoming a being, of change and cognition. So translation throughout the 21st century investigates the interplay between translational culture, especially in the key ethical and political, and indeed geopolitical relationship between self and other. Translation as a tool of mediation, for better or for worse, is never absent from cultural encounter, either peaceful or conflictive. Beyond this, is it possible to see translation not only as part of the movement between cultures, but as a key component of culture itself? Let us begin by considering this statement from Schleiermacher, who says, are we not often compelled to translate for ourselves the utterance of another who, though our compeer, is of different opinions and sensibility? Compelled to translate, that is, wherever we feel that the same words upon our own lips would have a rather different import than upon his, or at least the way here the more heavily, there the more lightly, and that, would we express just what he intended, we must needs employ quite different words and turns of phrase. And when we examine this feeling more closely, so that it takes on the character of thought, it would appear that we are translating. In other words, the key process of translation, its hermeneutic motion, its core as an interpretive practice, does not necessarily have to happen between different dialects, languages, or sign systems, but within them. How then is this translation as interpretation and interpretation as translation notion relate to culture? So to answer this, let us first consider what culture is. There are, of course, numerous definitions for this very broadly conceived term. But anthropologists and sociologists give us a good position to start from. A metaphor of culture as web or network captures pretty much what culture is and how it works. Man is an animal suspended, well, of course, woman, is an animal suspended in webs of significance he or her, himself or herself, has spun, in the trope put forward by Clifford Geertz. If culture is webbing, then translation as interpretation are the vehicle that facilitates the weaving and interweaving of webs, a force of mobility hidden beneath the definitions and surface workings of culture. Moreover, in the anthropological and the sociological sense, culture is the system of signs and meanings. The culture itself becomes a system of interpretation and representation. That is how we understand and how we talk about our understanding. If culture is understood as a system of signs, symbols, and signifiers, the shadow of translation is always there. System means understanding culture as a set of connected things or devices that operates together. This interconnected nature of system determines the existence of translation within it, inherent to the problem of mutual understanding across the different elements of that system. That is, movement from past to present, across groups, between discourses, etc. So after the fall of the Tower of Babel, humanity is fragmented, and translation functions as the glue connecting people together by, again, offering a new chance for understanding across difference. That is why George Steiner quotes his seminal book After Babel, in which, like the reverse version of Babel Tower, he writes of translation sticking the fragments of humanity together and offers a common ground for things to work as a system without erasing the markers of cultural difference. This is to say that if a set of signs and meanings are to become a culture, they need to work with one another, and the only possibility for this to happen is to invite translation as hermeneutic practice into the operations of culture. If we think of translation as interlocking but not homogenizing the system, we also need to think about translation in terms of signs, meaning, and understanding. Despite the clear line drawn by some thinkers where, for example, signs stand for something while meaning is the expression of the sense of the sign. For example, see Husserl, for example, to discuss the two terms separately makes little sense. Jacques Derrida, for example, argues, or he at least signals in reference to Husserl, that solitary mental life is meaningless. And moreover, meanings and signs are not the same thing. Rather, the interplay between them in terms of interpreting meanings as understanding is terrain of translation. We can now start to identify translation within the context of signs and meanings. For a sign to be a sign, it needs to represent, both in the sense of representing something that is generally understood, and in the sense of representing, that is to repeat and reissue, as the reader argues. For the discussion of representation in its general meaning, it is necessary for signs to represent or to signify something, although it is not always true that the same sign has to represent the same thing. A heart is both love and health, for example. So Putnam recognizes that our lingua mentis can rarely accept dissonance or interpretive openness, but points out that none of the methods of representation that we know about was the property that the representation intrinsically refer to, whatever it is that they are used to refer to. All of the representations we know about have an association with their referent, which is contingent and capable of changing as the world changes. This inherently translational in a number of ways. So translation explodes stability of interpretation and can only ever fix on a final meaning that ontologically is provisional. That is to say, it's opening to being unfixed again. And secondly, the idea that people associate representations with changeable reference remain a key topic in translation studies. This is one of the reasons why it is impossible to render a source text in terms of its structure of meaning equivalent to the target text, because In the words of fabled translator Eugene Ida, there is no universal system of signs or meanings to which all specific signs can be compared or evaluated. To represent in that case, translators invariably use the technique of a dynamic equivalence to a source text in target text, or they translate to the strategy of a certain scopus or purpose, because approaches lead us to the conclusion that any form of representation, whether of text as text or object as statement of understanding, is at least partially an act of translation. Moreover, for translation to be understood as representation, signs need to reissue themselves in a different context. As the reader explains, a sign which would take part but once would not be a sign. A purely idiomatic sign would not be a sign. A signifier must be formally recognizable in spite of and through the diversity of empirical characteristics that may modify it. This is to say that a sign can only be a sign when it can be repeated and reshaped in different circumstances. Translation or translational acts are inherently are inherent to such sameness, or to say the least, the re-recognizable characteristics in different contexts. Translation often start with the name to be the same, yet not purely idiomatic as the original. Readers who can understand both source and targeted languages can recognize the traces of the original writing even in the boldest translation attempts. There are always similarities between the two. There is the vast of the pure language, as Walter Benjamin calls it. So what is reissued in translation is not obviously the language nor the information, but the different broken pieces of the same pure language vase, the kinship between languages which rests in the intention that each language is to express. This is to say that the emphasis on the importance of sameness, again, sameness as not in terms of repeating information in two languages or even in the same language, but rather the intention that rests in pure language. The sameness is often found in translation studies, especially in the research where sameness and difference are deemed to be simultaneously inhabiting the object of translation. The concept of equivalence was, thus, developed to highlight the reissuing of meaning in translation. There are various concepts of equivalence defined by translation scholars. For example, NIDA again suggests two out of the many orientations, namely the formal equivalence and the dynamic equivalence. The former referring to the translation that seeks to reproduce several formal elements, and the latter to the translation that finds the closest natural equivalent to the source language message. So both concepts of equivalence often regarded or are often regarded as contradictory to each other, give rise to different representations of an object that is filtered through the process of translation. A word of warning, though, is due here, as the concept, or probably the concepts of equivalence, is or are gradually marginalized in translation studies. There are criticisms towards the equivalence paradigm that emphasize on the equal value, for example, by Professor Pym. The criticism is that the equivalence between the two languages is just an illusion. And the equivalence is a brief structure that has to be analyzed as such, which logically marks the end of equivalence as the central concept. And probably that is why Mona Baker, in her latest edition of her influential handbook, in other words, decided to include a new chapter called Beyond Equivalence, And I believe the latest encyclopedia, the Routledge Encyclopedia, exclude the entry of equivalence from it. But nevertheless, discussion of equivalence still help in identifying the difference in translation where meanings are issued and reissued. So in this regard, translation is rooted in contingency, in the shifting interstices of time and space, where meaning is generated and regenerated and processed into different forms of understanding. As a process whose method is inherently hermeneutic, translation is always open to different possible representations that accommodate in even the one same object. By way of conclusion, translation is present not only in any act of cultural encounter, but also within each individual culture in terms of the processes of interpretation and representation that bring commonality to that culture. In other words, it operates in terms of how we relate to, form part of, and promote our culture, and of course, in conversations between different cultures. It is the act of weaving webs of culture, of how individuals locate themselves within these webs. Why we need to be aware of the effects of translation is that, consciously or not, it engineers difference. Cross-cultural translation is, in that regard, inevitably intercultural. After all, translation represents the replication in one language and grammar of an act of discourse in an alien or other, with all the connotations postmodernism has granted the term. So in other language and grammar, the process of translation produces, for example, according to Wolfgang Iser, a liminal space in which two cultures intermingle before what might be termed a third space. That is the space of the translation as text that is elaborated. Meaning is always subject to the invariability of understanding. From exegesis to philosophical hermeneutics, the interpretation of social and cultural phenomena has arguably been the definitive act of humanistic scholarship. At the heart of such activity is an awareness of the complexity of representation, whether textual, visual, scientific, or ideological. It is in turn to the heart of these complex processes that translation takes us. So these are my references, some of my key references, and thank you very much. I hope to communicate more in this topic with you, and hopefully there will be one day when the pandemic ends, we can meet with each other face to face. Thank you very much.